Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. I'm Liz Goodrich, part of the Community Relations team, and you are here today for the final installment of our Deschutes by the Decade series that we have been partnering with Deschutes County Historical Museum to talk about Deschutes County, starting in 1920 up to the current day. And each month we're joined by Kelly Cannon Miller. She's the Executive Director for the Deschutes County Historical Society, which operates the Deschutes Historical Museum in downtown Bend. She is a graduate of Portland State University with an MA in History. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Oregon Encyclopedia and is a member of the Deschutes Cultural Coalition and writes for both the Oregon Encyclopedia and the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And today we're going to hear about 2000, Y2K, up to COVID-19.
Right.
So, Kelly, take it away.
Okay. This has been a load of fun to do with you. I'm going to pull up my share screen. Some things, boy, I got to tell you, for the 2000 to 2020, I had so many times where I thought, God, that was only, that feels like it was just yesterday that happened, and it was already 13 years ago that some things happened. And just the speed with which things have changed over the last 20 years in Deschutes County really came home for me doing this one and putting this one together. So I have to do my little disclaimer that this is 20 years worth of history that I'm going to try and pick just some individual nuggets, just little stories that I think illuminate the whole. Over the last year, we've done, 100 years, we've covered a lot. We've had some really big things. What was the area like during the World Wars, during the Great Depression? We've had the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. We've had a lot of stuff packed into the first 80 years that we've covered. And the goal has been to show what the community was like that the Deschutes Public Library has been supporting and been a pillar for during those years. So again, this is just a few stories from the last 20 years. And know that this is a time period that we at the Historical Society are actively trying to collect. There's lots of exciting things that have happened in the last 20 years that it hasn't occurred to anybody yet. It's way too soon to think about documenting it for posterity, for history. But this past 20 years has given us things like Bend Film. It's given us new high schools. It's given us all kinds of new businesses and industry that at some point we hope that you, our audience, can help us document. So we'll run down just a few stories of what this last 20 years has really done. And ultimately, it's been as transformative as 100 years ago. So between 1910 and 1920, you get this huge in-migration of Americans into, central and eastern Oregon and building cities out of the sagebrush. And what's happened in the last 20 years has been kind of repetitive of that in terms of having a huge influx of people. So at the start of the year 2000, the entire county is at 115,367 people. And you can see Bend is at 62,000, Redmond is at 13,000. Sisters has had a huge jump from where we left them in the 90s and is up to 2,000 people. And rather than leaving the 2020 figures for the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about them right now. And part of it is that we don't have the 2020 numbers yet. We are in a census year. We still will have to wait to see what the 2020 census, tells us about who we are. And I hope that you all have turned in your census forms, because if you've watched all of these talks with us, you know that the census is really important for the historical record. Right now, for 2019 figures, although sisters, we had to just go with a 2018 figure, the population has probably doubled in 20 years. We've gone from 115,000, we're up to 197,000 for the county. Bend crossed that magical line of 100,000 people which was a big deal for us because the Bend Emblem Club, founded way back in 1912, that was their goal, was to get Bend to grow past 100,000, and we finally did it. They thought we would do it by 1937. It took a little bit longer than that, but that's okay. We got there for them. So you can see the incredible growth that has happened in the last 20 years. That's the big story: growth, 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 growth. I want to throw in right here that during, kind of the middle of this 20-year period, the Great Recession happened, 2007 to 2009. Honestly, that is a lecture all in and of itself. What happened, why it happened, how it affected Deschutes County. So I'm just going to show you something that I suggest if you're interested in the Great Recession in Central Oregon, look up at the Milken Institute and look at their case study on the Bend, Redmond, Oregon area. It was produced in February of 2017. Has lots of great information and statistics on how the Great Recession affected this area, which gave us, it was bad. We had a huge unemployment rate of between 15 and 16%. A lot of people lost their homes. The construction industry, collapsed on itself. A lot of construction folks that we knew personally had to leave the area to find employment. It was not a good couple of years. However, when it comes to population growth, it didn't really stop. It didn't stop happening for Deschutes County, and our economy actually rebounded much quicker than a lot of other places around the country. So again, it's almost its whole own lecture. So this is all I'm going to say about the Great Recession with regards to this 20 years, is that we do have this very painful moment in the middle, but we're able to rebound from that in ways that other parts of the country don't do as quickly as we do. And this was another great employment statistic that's part of that package, and looking at our economy over the last 20 years, although this gives us clear back to 1990, you can see, if I can get my little arrow up, right here is the dip of the Great Recession, and this yellow color is construction. The blue is professional and business services, and so you'll see that a lot of these things take that dip in the recession, but they bounce back up, and most economists will say that the construction industry actually found its level median spot to be a really important part of our economy, but not so pivotal that we couldn't absorb future economic recessions, which unfortunately we're in the middle of finding out how flexible our economy actually is going to be with the COVID pandemic. So a book recommendation, if you want to really look at that period of time and how Deschutes County came through it, the book Our Towns by James and Deborah Fallows actually has a chapter on Bend that's really, really good, and shares a lot of great information about that part of Deschutes County during that time period. In addition to the book, they have some side articles that appeared from this body of research in the Atlantic, including one that featured the Deschutes Public Library. And this work was picked up by HBO for a miniseries, and they've actually been back to town doing some filming, have gotten some photographs from us. Unfortunately, 2020 being what it is, their production schedule has changed. So in addition to reading the book, I recommend following them on their website, ourtownsbook.com, for more on that period of time in Deschutes County. Some of the massive changes are really easy to track in numbers. So for example, Bend Parks and Rec, 1995, they have 36 parks and approximately 900 acres. 2020, you're looking at an agency that oversees 81 parks and open spaces. They are over 3,000 acres that they manage, and they have 70 miles of trail systems, including the Deschutes River Trail, which actually is an idea that dates back to Vince Genna, the founding father of the Bend Park system that we know today, first put out the idea of having the Deschutes River Trail system from Tumalo State Park all the way through clear back in 1954. And thanks to the growth of the last 20 years is actually coming to pass. We've seen new high schools. We get Summit High School in 2001. We get Ridgeview High School in 2012. We know we're going to have a new high school, Caldera, that opens in 2021, along with, you know, multiple elementary schools and some middle schools. The system has just really needed a lot to keep up with the massive population growth. And another major important change that has happened in the last 20 years, just to touch on it, is that Oregon State University Cascades campus was successfully founded during this 20-year time period. It starts in 2001 just as a branch campus operating out of COCC, but in 2012 it's authorized by the state to become one of the first brand new campuses that the state had invested in decades, and broke ground and was able to start offering classes on their own campus in 2015. And that's a huge economic driver and new player on the scene in town. The demographic changes are really hard. And one of the things to understand about this 20-year time period is that we have created from the sagebrush whole new neighborhoods in Redmond, in Sisters, in Lapine, in Bend, all around the county. We have seen the birth of neighborhoods that are just at the beginning of their history. And so I've got some Google Earth images to show you. This is Northwest Crossings in the year 2000. And I've left the road grids on there for you for orientation. So this is 2000. 2005, you see Summit High School down here. 2012, you start seeing housing crop up along these roads that have been mapped out. We start seeing parks. Here's 2017. And here's Northwest Crossings in 2019. And I'm sure that there's things missing that have been built in just the last year. So quite a difference in just 19 years' time. You have now a community that has its own identity, has events, has its own stores and restaurants and high school. And like I said, is at the beginning of its history. This is something that we got from Deschutes County Planning Department from Nick Lilac. He was gracious enough to share with us. It's important to understand as we look to the future and as we understand this moment in history that not all of the building and population that we talk about moving here has happened within city limits. And that has consequences for wildland fire, for groundwater health, for transportation. What you're gonna see as I move through the next series of slides, all of the little blue spots are places where Deschutes County has issued permits for construction. And so here we're gonna start in 1980 and go through the time to 2020 and just watch how the blue develops and increases until we get to 2017, and here we are in 2020. There's a lot of blue outside city limits. All of that construction in South County, east of Bend, in between Redmond and Bend, in between Bend and Sisters, all of that history of construction eventually has consequences for how we manage the county, how we manage fire, how we manage water, and how we manage transportation. Part of this development meant that the city of Lapine made history in 2006 by actually voting to incorporate as a city, even though Lapine has existed as long as Redmond and Bend and Tumalo and all of the rest of the towns and cities up and down the Highway 97 corridor. Lapine actually had remained an unincorporated place clear up until 2006 when voters decided that they really actually did need the benefits of a city government to help continue with the growth of the area. When you look on the left of the screen, you'll see the City of La Pine's comprehensive plan to see their zoning. But on the right, you'll see that zoning as it looks beyond the footprint of the city. So again, we still have this issue of a whole lot of development outside of city limits that has impacts for groundwater, particularly when it comes to La Pine, that will have an impact on our future in the county. Here is another spot of massive, massive change. So this is the old Mill District in 2000. So our talk last month about the 80s and 90s, we went over the fact that the 90s saw the decline and fall of the timber industry as an economic driver in Deschutes County, something that had been central to the lives of just about everyone in Deschutes County for decades. So here we have the post-industrial kind of wasteland that William Smith Properties purchased to be the old Mill District in this area. And this building right here was the first to go in, and its parking lots, that's the Regal Old Mill Cinemas when it was first built in 2000. Nothing else is around it yet. It's this outlier waiting for everything else to happen. And then watch as it goes through time. So here's 2005, 2011. We're starting to see our parks develop. The old, Les Schwab Amphitheater has come along. 2014, 2017, more parks. We get the Park District until we arrive here at 2019. And it's really an impressive transition. Can we imagine Deschutes County without the old Mill District? Not really, not in the same way that we couldn't really imagine not having the mills. And yet we lost the mills. This whole entire area over 20 years has been able to reinvent itself and reinvent the river in really impressive and dramatic ways. The river restoration that has happened over the last 20 years has actually, William Smith Properties has received awards for that river restoration work. So from industrial wasteland to commercial and livability success story in a lot of ways in just 19 years. But that had consequences. And so here's one of the big stories that I want to tell you in this talk is that of historic preservation and how that works when you have such enormous demographic change that is revealing itself on the landscape where you have so much construction and so much change in patterns. So the difference between the Mill District was that the Mill District was off limits except for the workers. Now that it's the old Mill District and it's open for commercial use, one of the impacts that had was just traffic patterns of how do you get people there. So as that develops, the pressure on the neighborhood that exists and lives between downtown Bend and the Mill District, where you have lots of homes where mill workers raised their families over the years, was in danger. And they wanted to preserve their neighborhood. So in 2001, the residents rallied together and formed the City of Bend's first historic district. It's the Old Town Historic District. You can see Wall Street is here. The museum where I am at right now is right here. The Old Mill District in Colorado and Arizona are down here. And this is the boundary taking in the Old Town Historic District. And what they found was that they not only protected their neighborhood and preserved it, their house values went up. Being next to a very high interest area that has things like concerts, people wanted to live there. And so what were the other consequences of that? Well, this building was also in between the Old Town Historic District neighborhood, and the Old Mill District. This is the crane shed. So those of you who have lived here for a long time will recognize the building that got called Big Red. Those of you who have moved here since 2004 and maybe have only heard stories about the crane shed and what happened, this is your building. The building was built in 1937. It was part of the Brooks Scanlon milling operations. There was a similar crane shed on the Shevlin-Hickson side that had long ago been lost to time. At the point that you see it here, it's actually owned by Clearwater Beverage. They were the last ones to use it in an industrial way. They had paid $725,000 for it in 1991. By 2000, and that time period when it sits on the edge of the Old Mill District, which is the hop-in place for real estate and real estate development, by 2001, the land underneath this building was worth more than the building itself. And Clearwater had sold it to Crown Investments for a profit in 2003 for $2.75 million, with the intent of developing it. So what happened next is a story not only of historic preservation, but it wasn't really about the building anymore. It was about the sense of history and community in a town that was trying to marry its longstanding history and the people who had lived here for many generations, most of whom had worked at the mill or benefited from it in some capacity, and marry that with the new population that was coming to town and what they wanted to see. So stepping back to those aerials again to 2000, here's the crane shed in 2000, and by 2005, here's the empty spot where the building had stood. Another point of reference for you, this is the box factory, one of the most popular places today, and here's the crane shed across from it. And these two buildings couldn't have more different fates. I think what the folks in the community who wanted to see the crane shed saved, what they believed was possible with these industrial buildings has actually been made possible across the street at the box factory, where you have a historic structure that was industrial in purpose and now has been given whole new life simply because the people who purchased it believed that the historic building added value to the place. It was called the crane shed simply because it had a ginormous crane in the interior of the building that ran along the roof and simply did crane things. It picked up the stacks of lumber that were stored inside and moved it from one end to the other. Pretty simple. Here's another shot of the building. So here's where the crane shed is. Here's the box factory. So Arizona Street is still an unpaved, well, it's paved, but it's still not part of the overall system yet of transportation coming through here over here. This is the Core Pine particle board factory, which will come down in 2017. So Crown Pacific only owned the crane shed for 7 months before they turned in a demolition permit request to the Historic Landmarks Commission, requesting that they be able to tear down the crane shed. And they gave testimony after testimony that the building could not be repurposed. They came up with a design plan to try and please the Landmarks Commission where they would rebuild the building in the image of the crane shed. However, the Landmarks Commission still really wanted to see the actual crane shed be saved, and there were designs on the table or proposals that you could save it and you could repurpose the structure. And what ended up happening was that Crown Pacific petitioned directly to the City Council to ask for the demolition permit and asked them to override the Landmarks Commission. And unfortunately, they were so confident in their position that during the City Council meeting, they actually had a demolition crew gathering by the crane shed, waiting for city council's approval that they would be issued a demolition permit. What they knew full well, though, is that just because city council came down on the side of Crown Investments and said, no, we're going to override Landmarks Commission and we're going to issue you your demolition permit, that isn't the same thing as actually issuing a demolition permit. So city council has a very unfortunate conversation about not allowing, the redevelopment of the area to be held up by historic standards. They agree with Crown Pacific, sorry, not Crown Pacific, but Crown Industries, that they're going to be allowed to take the building down. They then give the go-ahead, and under cover of darkness, under lights, as you can see in the one photograph there, they take down the building. And they do it on purpose, knowing that the Landmarks Commission and the folks that want to save the building still have appeals all the way up to the State Land Use Board. To circumvent that, they're willing to take on the penalties that they'll get. And so they take the building down. And sadly, the Landmarks Commission, while they're tearing it down in 2004, is having a meeting to plan what their next step, what their next appeal would be. And after their meeting, they find out that the building is already gone. And people were, rightly outraged. When you have a moment in time where huge amounts of people who don't know the history of the area have moved in, and a lot of them are just tearing down things and building new things and making the old population feel like that history isn't valued. This was proof to them. This was proof that the developers had bought and paid off city council. History was just up for sale. Nobody valued it, and developers could just do whatever they want and get away with it. And the fines, unfortunately, that the developers were hit with for this kind of, didn't prove them wrong. They got hit with a whopping $100,000 fine. And for the profit that they're going to make when they turn around and sell the bare land, it was easy for them to absorb that $100,000. They had also made the critical misstep of not understanding that asbestos was in the building. So they also faced just under $100,000 in fines from the state for the asbestos cleanup that they didn't do properly. But again, by the time they resell this land, it was a slap on the wrist. What does come from this, however, is that city council, while they were on the side of Crown for allowing them the demolition permit, they didn't appreciate the flagrancy of just tearing it down and not waiting for the demolition permit. So the end result is a good thing that the Landmarks Commission and the city planning were able to sit down and formally clean up the Landmarks Commission and demolition permit process so that there was no confusion over who could say yes or no to demolition permits. And they also significantly increased the penalty to that the city would be able to recover 20% of the current real market value of a property if there was a violation such as that one. So while it was a loss, no one knows if you really could have turned the crane shed into something like the box factory across the street. And you can see on the right, Crane Shed Commons has been built on that property as of a couple of years ago, and resembles the crane shed not at all. The end result was to strengthen our historic preservation process. So once again, in the history of the area, a loss does have something good coming out the other side. And if you've ever driven through the Old Mill District and seen one of these bus stops, now you know that $100,000 was used to build bus stops that looked like the crane shed, so that you have the buttresses over here, you have the red and you have the white top. And so, yeah, $100,000 went towards some memorial bus stops that are just supposed to remind you of the crane shed. Left a bitter taste in a lot of people's mouths. But the Old Mill District actually has some very concrete historic preservation success stories in and of itself. It's been the home for the railroad depot to be relocated, along with some logging camp cars and other stray historic buildings that needed a place to land and be saved, and the old mill district has been there for that. But most impressively has been the powerhouse. And who doesn't know the 3 stacks of the powerhouse? It's on the logo for everything with the old mill district, and it's a visual geographic landmark for everybody coming through Deschutes County to see those smokestacks and be reminded of the mill days. The powerhouse has gone on to a new life, primarily as REI. If you go into REI, one of my favorite things actually in historic preservation is that you can look up and there's a beam that comes across the ceiling that says Brooks Scanlon on it. And it always reminds me that that building was there because of the trees. It was an economy based on that natural resource, and yet REI, who caters to people who are going out in the forest today, that building is still providing a footprint for the economy that is dependent on the natural resources around us. So the Old Mill District does have some very significant preservation stories within it. The other success story in that pressure on building and construction is that the Drake Park neighborhood, just like it says, right along Drake Park, saw the success that the Old Town Historic District had in maintaining its character. And also it didn't hurt that it increased their property values. And so in 2005, members of the community got together and nominated themselves for the Drake Park Neighborhood Historic District, and successfully was listed in 2006. So in Bend, you get historic preservation as a defense against what development was bringing and the massive changes that explosion was bringing to the community. And you had people who used it to save a sense of community. They wanted to save their sense of place. Up the highway in Redmond, you've got the same process of historic preservation that has actually been used as an offense of a means of reinvigorating the community and being ready for the population explosion that has spilled over from Bend and out into Lapine and into Redmond. And so here on the left, you'll see what downtown Redmond looked like when Highway 97 came right down on 6th. And on the left, you see downtown Redmond after Highway 97 has been rerouted out from downtown. So something that had happened to downtown Bend clear back in the 1960s is afforded in Redmond in 2007. And this is one of those things that I'm like, really, that was already 13 years ago. But in 2007, to relieve traffic congestion and pressure in downtown Redmond, Highway 97 is rerouted to the route that we know today, which is, if I can get my arrow back going here, is to come around the city like this and head north that way, when right here is where the highway used to cut through. And what this has freed Redmond up to do is to create a downtown historic district and preserve several really important and cool and amazing buildings as part of an urban revitalization process for Redmond. So on the left, you'll see 2 huge success stories for the city, both of which have been given awards by Restore Oregon for their renovation and repurpose. Up top is Evergreen School, which is now Redmond City Hall, a beautiful building, very well done. And down below is the new Redmond Hotel, which was renovated and reopened last year. So demographic population changes, huge impact of development on the entire county. In the city of Bend, you have historic preservation efforts happening as a means to preserve a sense of community and act in a defensive way to protect those areas that felt sacred to the community, and also educate people who are moving here as to why they're sacred, why they're important, and why they needed to be saved And in Redmond, you have that same system being used in an offensive way to encourage development, because let's face it, people actually do love to find historic places. That the era of strip malls and everything feeling same, you can find new life and new economic development in historic places. On the flip side, however, the other way that the historic preservation process has been used was with the Pilot Butte Canal. And in 2016, the Pilot Butte Canal Historic District was listed with the National Park Service. Again, done by landowners. One thing that a lot of people don't understand about the National Register process, it is not federal government down. It is local community driven. Things get listed on the National Register only because the residents who live there want to see it on the National Register. And then once it's on the National Register, the federal guidelines, the Secretary of Interior standards, help guide the management of those places. But again, control of them lives at the local level with your local landmarks commission. So if you think back to the crane shed, and the Landmarks Commission was overseeing any proposed changes to that, those were local people who were serving on the Landmarks Commission, who were just using preservation guidelines to help determine the future. But again, it's driven by people who live in the community who want these things. And this one was very controversial because with water rights, you have many, 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 many owners. So you have all of the people who own property alongside the canal. You have the irrigation district who owns the canal. And then you have the people who own the water inside the canal with their water rights. So when the Central Oregon Irrigation District proposed piping, the oldest sections of the Pilot Butte Canal, the landowners who wanted to see the canal remain open use the historic designation process to tap into the history that is genuinely there and have it preserved as a historic district, which did mean that Central Oregon Irrigation did drop their proposals for piping, but it doesn't rule out that piping couldn't come back as a topic in the future. Unfortunately, with historic districts, there isn't anything saying that you can't tear it down or get a demolition permit or pipe a historic canal. It simply means that the Landmarks Commission has to help be a part of that decision-making process. Another story that I wanted to bring up from this time period is a different kind of preservation. It's a water conservation type of preservation, and that's the Whitches Creek Restoration Project that began in 2014. It took 3 years. It was led by the Deschutes Land Trust, who owns this section now. They own a 4-mile stretch of Whitches Creek next to Camp Polk. One of the reasons why I love this project is that one of the most historic spots in the county, Camp Polk and Camp Polk Cemetery, is right next to their holdings. And not only do they honor the history of the site that they have managed to keep it in line with their conservation work with Whitches Creek. So this is a 3-year, $15 million project that's all about fish restoration and habitat. How do we bring back salmon and steelhead and trout habitat in areas where creeks and waterbeds were significantly changed for the purposes of agriculture early in the 20th century and into the 20th century. So here you have a 4-mile section of creek that had been physically moved for purposes of agriculture and irrigation. We know now, 100 years later, the consequences of those choices, and what several agencies have worked very hard in this spot: the Deschutes River Conservancy, Deschutes Land Trust, the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, the irrigation districts. They have all worked on this project to restore the floodplains and the water flows for the purposes of fish. It's a hugely successful project that also has educational benefits in teaching people about riparian areas. And you can see down on the chart in the bottom corner, the success in increasing the water flow through this area. And I don't think this is the last kind of project like this that we're going to see in Deschutes County in the future. So I consider this a huge conservation success in the history of the last 20 years. And the other thing that's really shaping this area is the history of fire. It's kind of hard to not be aware of that, as we've just experienced, you know, a week's worth of horrible air quality. This is a great diagram put together by Ed Keith at Deschutes County Natural Resources that shows the large fires. So anything over 100 acres between 1900 and 2019. And what I'll point out with the arrow, it's too small to see the names of the fires, but the red are fires that have happened since 2010. Oranges have happened since 2000. You will see though on the chart over here, this is 1900 working through to 2019. The idea that we haven't had bad fire years earlier in the century isn't true. If you look at 1910, you'll see that we had a couple really bad fires early in the century that are part of the early 20th century process of how do we deal with fire, and working on fire suppression only as our means of fighting fire, and not yet coming to a place where we actually live with good fire management practices. And we're still working on that, as evidence of the fires of 2020. Here's a list of the fires that were over 100 acres in Deschutes County between 2000 and 2018. Cache Mountain, Davis Link, Black Crater, Milliken, Rooster Rock, Pole Creek, a lot of fires. A massive fire though that didn't actually take place in Deschutes County but affected our region significantly was the B&B Complex fire in 2013. And then obviously the current fire season, while happening outside our county borders by and large, still is a major impact on how we manage our forests here, but also because Deschutes County has been identified in the last 20 years as a major evacuation point. So we've seen that this year with folks being evacuated out of the valley and coming over to Deschutes County as their evacuation point. The photograph is actually from the Skeleton Fire of 1996, but really illustrates that urban-rural wildland interface and the problems that fire present for us. That 2003 netted a historic moment in county history. It's the only visit that Deschutes County has had from a sitting president, the active president, George W. Bush, seen here in August, getting a debrief from the Deschutes National Forest Supervisor, Leslie Weldon, who's still at work for the Forest Service in Washington, D.C. as we speak. This is them in Redmond getting a debrief on the status of the fire. And President Bush was here as part of his Healthy Forest Initiatives Act passed in 2003. Again, you know, with history, we're still working on how to effectively live within our forests given the climate change and management changes that we're trying to marry together as we move in further into the 21st century. And then 2020 has ended pretty historically, everyone. So these are some photographs that we actually hired Gary Calicott to take some shots for us for the collection of what things looked like in April and May at the height of the shutdown for COVID-19. You'll see our library that we're talking on behalf of today with a hand wash station out front, empty Wall Street, middle of the day, parks closed, public health alert signs, Sisters, the Redmond Airport, This is El Sancho trying to stay in business and serve takeaway that you could pick up outside the door. And here's some projections. Again, this is coming from Deschutes County Development. So once we survive this crazy year of 2020, the population projections over time, that growth that we've experienced the last 20 years is only going to continue. Ultimately, the end run is that by the 2060s, we'll be nearing 500,000 people in the county. If you look at 2020 here, you can see that their projections actually, if you remember back to the beginning of the talk, are a couple thousand people shy of where we actually have been. So buckle up, everyone, because the population is only going to continue to grow. But hopefully, if the last 20 years have shown us anything, it's that those changes are bringing new and exciting opportunities, new industries, new development, things that can be done, but at the same time maintain a sense of community and who we have always been, and be a continuation of the people who we were in 1920. So that's what I have for you, Liz. Let me see if I can stop share here.
Awesome. And it was, yeah, that is a weird period of time. I'm surprised you didn't talk about Y2K. I guess it didn't really have much.
There was a lot to choose from. It was a non-event. I remember everyone stockpiling everything that the computers weren't going to be able to recognize 4 digits, and everything was going to crash and come to a screeching halt. Actually, that's kind of funny because I think what everyone expected Y2K to do, COVID-19 has done.
Yeah.
It's going to shut everything down. Everyone will be at home. You better stockpile all your water and your food. And
yeah, it's certainly been the event that's shaping our world.
Yes,
but I have just a couple of questions. So I was wondering, in the graph that you were talking about the recession, I noticed that the hospitality section of our economy didn't really seem to move, that it stayed pretty resilient against everything else. Yeah. But now we see the how COVID is impacting hospitality, and that the recession didn't have much impact, but this crisis does.
Yeah. When one of honestly, the current situation of the world is one of the reasons why I didn't delve into the recession very much, because the story coming out of the recession was, how do we make ourselves more resilient so that during the recession, the construction industry was, I think, between 11 and 12% of the county's jobs were held in the construction industry. And that's a big chunk. And so coming out of the recession, all of the planning was about, how do we make ourselves more balanced so that if one thing, really goes off the cliff, the whole community doesn't suffer and get dragged down with it. And, reading through a lot of the materials from 2017 and 2018 and looking at how the medical community actually, that's another thing that I didn't get into very much for the last 20 years, is the rise of the medical industry in Central Oregon as a key economic driver and a resource for a lot of Eastern Oregon and Southeastern Oregon, that you can come to Bend for services that before you maybe have to go to Portland for. That's also, in addition to the community benefit of having that health system here, it's an economic benefit as well, and it has grown as part of that sector. But boy, you talk about, yeah, sure, we were very, very successful in diversifying after the recession, and the world gave us 2020, where we're gonna slap something on you that takes out multiple things all at once and see how well you do from that. So it's an interesting time, and it'll be interesting to see in the next 2 years, as the economic data cruncher folks start to put forward here, this was the impact. This is what this actually meant for our region.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering about, I think that COVID has really revealed that you don't necessarily have to live where you work in this day and age of high technology. And so, I mean,
Yes.
are we seeing urban refugees? Like, we don't want to, if I can work from home, I might as well live in a place like Central Oregon.
So here's my guess. Here's my historian guess for the future, is that it's not going to be unlike the recession, that we're going to find out that a chunk of our economy was very well suited for this and very well prepared for it, and that a section of our economy in Deschutes County came through it pretty okay. And what we're left to figure out is how well we were able to support the hospitality, the retail, the tourism-driven part of our economy, to be able to aid them and pull them through. But how quickly will that rebound? And in a situation where Americans can't travel abroad yet, and when will we be able to travel abroad the way we used to? Being a local tourism spot for regional tourism the way we are, we might find that we pull out of it quicker than other areas, like we did in the Great Recession. That's my guess.
Sounds like a good guess. Thank you so much. So to all you watching the program here today, don't forget there is a link to fill out an online survey. We are always interested in getting feedback. And if you have found your way to our YouTube channel, you can see all of the great recordings that we've done with Kelly as part of the Deschutes by the Decade series, as well as all kinds of other great programs. Thank you for joining us today. And Kelly, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
We'll have to find more things to talk about.
I don't think that's a problem.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Thank you.
Thanks.